Imagine waking up in a country that almost nobody believed could survive. A tiny island, smaller than many cities in the world. No oil, no gold, no farmland to feed its people. Not even fresh water of its own, it had to be imported. The streets were full of slums, unemployment was rampant, racial tensions simmered, and gangs often fought in the alleys. This was Singapore in the early 1960s. And then, one man looked at this fragile, divided society and declared that it would become a modern global city, respected by the world. His name was Lee Kuan Yew. At that time, even his closest allies weren't sure if he was dreaming too big. But within one generation, Singapore would transform from a struggling colony into one of the richest, safest, and most admired countries on earth. This is the real story of how Lee Kuan Yew transformed Singapore into a global hub. When Lee Kuan Yew became Singapore's first prime minister in 1959, the island was still under heavy British influence. The British had used Singapore as a naval base and a trading outpost, but they were pulling back, leaving behind a vulnerable, underdeveloped state. Most people lived in poor housing. Unemployment was sky-high. Riots fueled by racial and political differences erupted often. The Chinese, Malays, and Indians who made up the population were divided, and resentment boiled under the surface. To make matters worse, Singapore had no natural resources. No oil like its neighbors, no rubber plantations like Malaysia, no tin mines, no large rivers for hydroelectric power. Just swampy land, overcrowded slums, and a desperate population. Many people looked at Singapore and said, "This place is doomed." But Lee Kuan Yew was not the kind of leader who accepted doom. He had studied law at Cambridge, seen how institutions could shape societies, and he understood that survival depended not on what Singapore had, but on what it could build. He believed that with discipline, good governance, and the right strategy, this little island could achieve something that history books would record forever. Yet fate threw him a brutal test. In 1963, Singapore joined Malaysia, hoping to find stability and access to a larger market. But the union was rocky. Tensions between Singapore's largely Chinese population and Malaysia's Malay-led government exploded into conflicts. By 1965, the marriage was over. Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia. Independence wasn't achieved in triumph, it was forced upon them, with bitterness and fear. Lee Kuan Yew appeared on national television, tears streaming down his face, as he told the people, "For me, it is a moment of anguish. All my life, my whole adult life, I have believed in merger and unity of the two territories. In that moment, Singapore stood alone, weak, defenseless, and unwanted." Think about that. A country that didn't even want to be independent, suddenly cut off, with no natural resources, no army, no allies to lean on. How do you survive when even your neighbors doubt your future? This was the spiral of suspense that Lee and Singapore faced. And yet, Lee Kuan Yew did not crumble. He turned this forced independence into a fire that fueled his vision. He decided that if Singapore couldn't rely on natural resources, it would rely on human resources. If it couldn't depend on a large domestic market, it would plug itself into the world as a hub of trade, finance, and investment. If it couldn't overpower its neighbors with military might, it would outsmart them with strategy, diplomacy, and efficiency. Lee's first priority was survival. He understood that without jobs, people would be angry, and riots would continue. So he focused on attracting foreign investment. He and his team created the Economic Development Board, a one-stop agency that invited multinational corporations from America, Europe, and Japan to set up factories and offices in Singapore. They offered tax breaks, stability, and something that many countries in the region could not promise: clean, corruption-free government and reliable laws. Lee once said, "The moment key leaders are corrupted, the moment they influence people in power to favor them, then the system will collapse." So he built a government that punished corruption harshly, paid civil servants competitive salaries to reduce temptation, and insisted on meritocracy. Investors who were skeptical at first began to notice. In Singapore, contracts were honored, officials did not demand bribes, and infrastructure worked. Slowly, the island's reputation changed. At the same time, Lee tackled one of the most explosive issues: housing. In the 1960s, more than two-thirds of Singaporeans lived in slums or crowded shophouses with poor sanitation. Fires, diseases, and crime were rampant. Lee launched the Housing Development Board, which built massive new housing estates with running water, electricity, and proper sewage. But there was another genius behind this move. He deliberately mixed different races within housing blocks, so Chinese, Malays, and Indians lived side by side. This reduced racial segregation and forced communities to integrate. By giving people decent homes and mixing communities, Lee not only improved living standards but also built social harmony. Stability at home made it easier to attract investment from abroad. But jobs and housing weren't enough. Lee knew that Singapore's people had to be its biggest strength. He emphasized education, making English the working language of government, business, and schools. This was a masterstroke. With English, Singaporeans could communicate with global companies, connect with technology, and access knowledge from around the world. Yet at the same time, Lee insisted that children also learn their mother tongues Chinese, Malay, or Tamil so that cultural identity would not be lost. Over time, this bilingual policy created a population that was comfortable both locally and globally. Skilled, disciplined, and educated workers became Singapore's strongest export. Infrastructure was another pillar. Lee poured resources into building one of the best ports in the world. Singapore's geographical location was already strategic. It sat at the crossroads of major shipping routes, but without efficiency, it meant nothing. Under Lee, Singapore's port became a model of speed, reliability, and low corruption. Ships from across the globe stopped there, and Singapore became a hub for trade. Later, he built Changi Airport, which wasn't just an airport, it was a symbol. Clean, efficient, welcoming, and world-class. Today, Changi is often rated the best airport in the world, but its roots go back to Lee's vision that if Singapore was to be a global hub, every first impression mattered. Singapore Airlines, too, became not just a carrier but a brand of excellence, connecting the island to every corner of the globe. Of course, not everything was smooth. Singapore faced real threats. In its early years, the island had virtually no army. Surrounded by larger neighbors, it was vulnerable. Lee had to build a defense force from scratch. He introduced compulsory national service, training young men to defend their country. This policy, though tough, built a sense of discipline and national pride. On top of that, global economic crises hit. Oil shocks in the 1970s threatened to cripple energy supplies. Currency instability in the 1970s and 80s shook financial markets. Each time, Singapore had to adapt. One of the smartest moves came in the 1970s, when global finance was in turmoil. Lee saw an opportunity and turned Singapore into a hub for currency trading by creating the Asian dollar market. With favorable regulations and taxes, he attracted banks and traders. From then on, Singapore wasn't just a manufacturing and shipping hub, it was a financial powerhouse. But there was a cost. Lee Kuan Yew was known for being strict, even authoritarian. The press was tightly controlled. Opposition politicians were harassed or jailed. Strict laws governed behavior, from chewing gum bans to harsh punishments for crime. To many in the West, this looked like dictatorship. But to Lee, it was necessary. He once said, "If you are going to govern a country, you must have discipline. The alternative is disorder and ruin." Many Singaporeans accepted this trade-off. They gained safety, stability, jobs, housing, education, and rising incomes. In exchange, they lived with fewer political freedoms. For them, it was worth it. By the 1980s and 1990s, Singapore had completed its transformation. The skyline filled with modern skyscrapers. Banks from New York, London, and Tokyo had their regional headquarters there. Electronics, Petrochemicals, shipping, and finance drove the economy. Per capita income, once among the lowest in Asia, was now among the highest. Singapore became known worldwide as a symbol of efficiency, cleanliness, and prosperity. And all this was achieved without the natural wealth that many of its neighbors enjoyed. When Lee stepped down as Prime Minister in 1990, Singapore was firmly on the map as a global hub. He continued to serve as senior minister and later minister mentor, advising future leaders. His influence shaped the country long after he left office. When he passed away in 2015, world leaders from U.S. presidents to Chinese premiers praised him as one of the greatest statesmen of the 20th century. Yet even today, debates remain. Did Lee sacrifice too much freedom for growth? Could Singapore's success have been achieved in a more democratic way? Or was his hardline approach the only way to turn a fragile colony into a miracle state? These questions keep historians and politicians busy. But one fact is undeniable. Under Lee Kuan Yew's leadership, Singapore went from being dismissed as a hopeless island to being admired as a global success story. And the lessons are powerful. Vision matters. Without Lee's belief in Singapore's potential, the island might have collapsed. Institutions matter. Clean government, reliable courts, and professional civil servants make investors trust a country. People matter. Housing, education, healthcare, these are the foundations of stability. Trade-offs are real. Sometimes you give up freedom for order, and sometimes you accept discipline for growth. And perhaps the biggest lesson of all, your starting point does not define your destiny. Singapore began with nothing, but with strategy, discipline, and determination, it became something extraordinary. So the moral is this: no matter how small you are, no matter how poor your beginning, with vision and determination, transformation is possible. Lee Kuan Yew once said, "I have spent my life, so much of it, building up this country. There's nothing more I need to do. At the end of the day, what have I got? A successful Singapore. What have I given up? My life." His life was his country, and his country became his legacy. If this story of Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore moved you, I want to hear your thoughts. Which part of his leadership inspired you the most? Was it his fight against corruption, his housing policies, or his bold vision of turning nothing into something? Comment your thoughts below. Share this story with friends who believe small beginnings can lead to great outcomes. And if you want more powerful real stories of leaders, nations, and changemakers who reshape the world, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Together, let's keep exploring how vision plus action can change history.